Before we get to our episode of Magic in the Room, I want to invite you to take our new online course called Getting It Done, Mastering the Art of Productivity. This self-paced online course will help you get more done in less time by just simply understanding the science of productivity. Check out the course at purposeandperformancegroup.com/online learning or find the link in the show notes. I hope you learn a lot from today's episode of Magic in the Room.
Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
I'm Hannah Bratterud, and today we're joined by none other than our resident scholar, Dr. Bob Schooley. Welcome.
Thanks, Hannah. It's great to be here. Good to see you, Luke.
Yeah.
So today we thought we would talk about a really fun topic. As we've been going through, I think the whole world was going through some unprecedented, challenging times. I think we've all had, different experiences with, it's maybe been more stress than usual for most people over the past year and a half. And
I think that's a fair statement.
you think so?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because I think regardless of what everybody was experiencing in their personal lives, right, if you already have a certain level of stress or going through personal change or different types of challenging situations, you add a pandemic on top of that, and things can feel like they're a little out of control pretty quickly.
It's kind of the perfect storm, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Or it is.
Right?
I think we're still in it.
Yeah, I think we're still in it. We've been talking about some of the fallout of what's been happening in the world of work and with the Great Resignation. And so what do we do when things get bad? How do we respond? Dr. Bob, you asked a question recently of, do we all turn inward when times get bad? So we're going to talk about some different terms, and I would love to know, though, first, just out of curiosity, what's kind of your go-to default knee-jerk stress reaction when you're experiencing something stressful, really challenging? Luke, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, for me, probably two things happen at once. One is that I just try and push through whatever the hard thing is, and I think I can outwork whatever the stressor is, and I'll figure this out. I'll move forward. I'll just grit it out. And then the other thing is I tend to do that myself. And so, I will usually isolate, become less expressive and, less communicative with the people closest to me, and just kind of deal with it and try and just grind through. And most of the time, that serves me well. I mean, maybe, right? Maybe not. I at least survive, and it doesn't have to go further than that. Other times, if it's something incredibly stressful or that I can't navigate on my own, then after that first attempt, then I don't know that I really attempt anything harder. I just try and work harder and get more and more isolated until usually someone else is like, "What is wrong with you? You're treating all of us horribly. Why aren't you talking about anything?" And so then I'm like, "Oh, okay, yes, I don't necessarily have to just grind this out on my own." But sometimes it gets to that point and sometimes it doesn't. And I just kind of navigate it and then kind of go back into the norm.
Okay. All right. What about you, Bob?
Yeah, very similar. I think for me, you think of the grief cycle, and that starts with denial.
Yeah.
And I think personally, when I experience something bad or challenging, stressful, whatever, fear, I tend to kind of stay stuck. I go kind of in the spin cycle. I spend an inordinate amount of time in denial or anger and even, when you get down to depression, I think I tend to be an introvert, and when something bad happens, I tend to kind of go back inward. But then also I have a pretty high growth orientation to my mindset. And I see that kind of impacted. I tend to really kind of retreat more to a fixed mindset because it's kind of survival mode. I'm kind of like, it's almost like my brain, that system 1 kicks in and it's very emotional. And I think I have these signals that basically say, hey, let's don't get real clever here. Let's go with what we know will work. But unfortunately, I think a lot of that kind of turns into I'm denying what's happening. I'm not acknowledging it. And unfortunately, I have this part of me too that says, hey, if I deny it and don't recognize it, it'll go away by itself. If
I don't acknowledge it doesn't exist.
It's not real. That's great. So, and we know how that ends up. That's not a good place to be in. So got all sorts of dysfunction going on there when it hits. But
yeah, I think similarly for me, I tend to just kind of put one of two things happen. Either if there's like a multiplicity of things that are happening all at once, that can get really overwhelming. And I can tend to get into this like sort of paralyzed mode where I can't take action on anything because it just feels like too much and I don't know where to start. And then I just don't do anything and retreat inward, like stop really engaging. Or I put blinders on and I'm like, okay, this is the only thing I can focus on right now. It's the only thing that exists. I got to just really stay focused on this one thing, and then everything else in my life just sort of falls apart because I get into this thinking or feeling that I just got to do this one thing. If I look at anything else right now, it's going to distract me from, the one thing that's right in front of me that I have to take care of. And so it's a little bit of a, all or nothing kind of kind of response.
But that's kind of interesting, kind of like you have two ends of that spectrum. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so I think what we want to talk about today a little bit is, part of, how does our mindset kind of influence how we respond to the challenges in life, right? We can't really always choose our circumstances. We don't always have control over what comes at us or how life just happens at times. So I want to explore what do we have control over, right? What are the responses? And I think we're all familiar with kind of the term fight or flight, right? When we're in a stressful situation and we are, we get into this fight or flight mode, except that it's not really that relevant for modern life, right? And Western society, like getting into a fist fight, like literally fighting, not to say that doesn't happen, but if we take it into the work context, that's usually not how we tend to resolve a stressful situation or just like run for our lives, right? But
it's usually not the most helpful way to respond.
Exactly. Just punch your colleague in the face. If I don't like what you're saying, Luke. But I do think a lot of us kind of experience versions of that, right? So either we're facing something head on and with, in your case, Luke, I'm just going to attack this problem and I'm going to just stay at it and fight it out, right? Or in my case, I'm like, this is just too much. I'm going to freeze up or just retreat and go away. Yeah. And that's kind of the fear response, right? Try to get away from the problem. So I think your question earlier, Bob, that's been kind of rumbling in the back of my mind. We've had a whole episode on, actually a series of episodes on mindset, right? And we have this concept of inward versus outward. Could you just share with us, just for everybody who maybe hasn't heard all those episodes, what's, just in 3 minutes, what are the different dimensions of mindset?
Sure. So in Igniter Mindset, we're looking really at kind of two fundamental orientations. The first being kind of, are you more inward in that you tend to focus on, hey, here's my to-do list. This is what I need to do. These are my goals. These are what I'm trying to accomplish. Nothing wrong with that. That's very good and healthy and important. But to the extent that you're able to see the other end of that spectrum, which would be, okay, what are the people around me trying to accomplish? Or what do they need? How can I support them? What could I do that would make their lives better? So unfortunately, there are some of us that are way inward, and we tend to focus on kind of what's right in front of us. Or some of us are too way outward as well, in that they basically don't have boundaries, and they literally make some pretty amazing sacrifices for the people around them. So what I think is important, though, about this, and I'm not too crazy about, saying that they're ends of the spectrum or whatever, and I don't want to infer one is good, one is bad. They both have luggage or baggage. I'm sorry, however you want to say that. But and then on the other scale, the other orientation that we mentioned, there's what we refer to as fixed and outward. Someone with a fixed orientation, basically, they feel like, I can't really learn anything new. I'm not going to be able to develop any skills. We call it the Popeye mode. I am what I am. It's just kind of like, I'm not going to change. On the other end of that orientation is what we would call a growth mindset. And this is somebody that feels like, I can learn, I can grow, I can build new skills. I like the challenge. I love feedback. It's not criticism, it's help. Where someone that's more inward or fixed, would basically, any kind of feedback, that it's hard for them to hear that you mean I'm not perfect, or it's kind of so when we refer to Igniter Mindset, what we're trying to help people do is to understand that we're looking for leaders, or we would encourage leaders to have more of a growth orientation and more of an outward orientation, where you're always looking for, hey, I can get better, and I can also help everyone around me. So that's kind of just a quick overview of Igniter Mindset.
Yeah. So that's really, to me, what's, interesting about this whole conversation about when times are bad, when things are really challenging, what's our default, right? And I do think very often our default is to go inward. And I think even for most humans, we probably start out, most children have a pretty inward mindset because it's, that's all is your own experience. Exactly. And as we evolve as humans, becoming more aware of the people around us, their needs, without going overboard, to your point, where you just become a doormat and you have no boundaries and you can't stand up for yourself either, right? So being able to take care of yourself while being aware and responsive to the needs of others. So the thing is, when we're under pressure, right, we tend to, what the brain does is default to our highest level of habit. So what is our habit? What are the things that we tend to go to when we're fatigued, when we're stressed out, when we get flooded with, anxiety or whatever, however we look at stressful situations, that's what we're going to revert to. And I think that's one of the reasons why becoming aware of the different mindsets, and that we can choose our mindset and we can choose to grow into more of a growth mindset, we can choose more of an outward orientation, that can be really helpful when it comes to stressful, high pressure situations as well. Yeah.
Hey, and if I could just add something to that, Hannah, I think that's a great, what you said about, when there's a lot of stress or pressure, we tend and we kind of revert to almost like childlike, and it's really survival mode. Self-preservation. We're born very inward. I totally agree with that. But you know what's kind of interesting is when you look at the other orientation as far as fixed and growth. Think about children, young toddlers, young kids. They're always asking. What's the question they're always asking? Why?
Why?
They want to know why. Well, yeah, exactly. Why does this work? How does it work? Their minds are just like they're just taking in. And unfortunately, it's kind of a sad deal, but we kind of we discourage that, and unfortunately, I think so. It's kind of fascinating you said that, because I do agree with that. At birth, we probably are very inward. But I also think we're very growth. I think as human beings, when we're young, we tend to be more inward, selfish, if you will, and we tend to be more outward in that we're curious. And it's kind of interesting. I think what happens over those next 12 or 13 years, that's where it just starts kind of moving all over the place.
Yeah.
Depending on kind of the environment you're in, the type of parenting that you receive, the schooling that you receive. There's just a lot of things. And, we tend to lean towards, your mindset's pretty much in place by the time you're 12, 13 years old. It's going to maybe change a little bit, but we think it's pretty much, it's kind of settled in by then. It's kind of interesting, though. There are those that basically some research that's come out that they feel like some of our mindset is in our DNA. We're wired with those orientations, which I'm still trying to get my head around that one. But
yeah, that one's challenging for me, because I know that part of definitely our personality, some of it is hardwired.
Right.
But to me, mindset is a different thing than personality.
I would agree.
And I would say that mindset is something that we can choose to change over time.
Agreed.
With awareness.
Totally agree. And that's the $1 million word you just said right there, self-awareness.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the key of this. This is when you're in the middle of a perfect storm, the degree to which you can just kind of stop for a second, gather yourself and become self-aware and say, okay, I'm in a bad storm. So then you start kind of settling down and saying, okay, what do we need to do in order to move forward? Because a lot of us, and I think it's the human nature that when we hit that storm, the first reason, we start asking, why is this happening to me? Why is it going on right now? How did it get what started all of this? I think as human beings, we're very rational. We want to know why now, why this, and that's okay. I think to me, it's healthy if you're self-aware and you're kind of in that stage of where you're trying to figure out what the hell's going on, and then it's also very important to be self-aware of, where am I in this grief cycle? Am I caught up in denial? Am I moving towards bargaining? Am I moving towards acceptance? So I just think that's a great word to use, Hannah, is self-aware. Kind of know where you are, and I would have a little grace. We're kind of referring to this, and I don't mean to diminish this at all. I know for some it's been a really horrible, difficult time. But I think it's important to kind of know, hey, there's really no. Don't be embarrassed or beat yourself up that you're not handling it like you'd like to, or that you're seeing other people handle it. Just kind of know, hey, it's my journey. I'm going through this. Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit. I may have stumbled. I may have spent way too much time in denial. But you know what? I'm a human being, and I'm going to keep moving forward.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about kind of individual response to stress. Luke, what have you seen in terms of organizations and leaders, and how a leader's response in a challenging time can influence an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, excuse me. It's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on the personality of the organization and of the leader. But there are a few techniques when a leader has awareness that they can use to be able to move people through those hard times. One of those is to really dispel the fear of failure. The other thing is to just move forward. So have that bias to action.
Yeah.
And then another thing is just to maximize the good for the most people.
Right.
And so, you know, if you use those principles, you kind of take that, well, there's a right answer off the table. And oftentimes organizations, especially if they, you know, are kind of a legacy organization that's been built on kind of financial control and hierarchical design and things like that, they'll often fall into this thinking trap that there's a right and wrong answer to any sort of business strategy decision that comes across through the environment or whatever it is, and or in their market. And I think if instead a leader or a team of leaders says, okay, how do we just move forward with that bias to action? How do we maximize the good for the most amount of people? And how do we minimize the fear of failure? Those can be some helpful guideposts on the way forward. Now, I didn't really directly answer your question. How do people respond? And I think it's kind of all over the place, but oftentimes it's a lot of the things that we shared about ourselves, you know, turning inward and either just tackling the problem or avoiding the problem. I will say that organizations that can't have healthy conflict, we probably see more avoidance and more maybe fighting, right? Those are the two kind of ends of the spectrum of conflict. You either avoid it or you have unhealthy conflict where you're having conflict around people's personas, personalities, values,
conflict.
Right. Instead of having healthy conflict around the idea or the strategy or the tactic that you want to take moving forward. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I've mentioned the book, The Upside of Stress, I think on this podcast before, as, you know, something that was really kind of mind-blowing for me because, and we've had episodes here where we've talked about the negative effects of long-term stress and burnout, right? And the risks of burnout and what happens when we have elevated levels of cortisol over time, what happens in our brains, our bodies, and how unhealthy that is. And so the interesting thing, there's a book called The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal. We'll make sure we put a link to it in the show notes here. But she really challenges that whole notion of stress is only bad for you. It is true that stress is bad for you, especially when you believe that it is. So our belief about stress, and I would say even our mindset about stressful life situation, 100% impact how bad it is for us, or on the reverse, how good it is for us. So she actually talks about how you can learn to get good at stress, because very often our response is like, oh, I just got to get rid of the source of the stress. And yes, there are things in our lives that are, you know, ongoing sources of stress that, you know, if we can get rid of those, it will definitely solve some things, right? But this whole notion that we can live a completely stress-free life is probably not super realistic, right? Stressful events are going to happen. Life is going to happen. And in fact, one of the things that the author talks about in this book is that a meaningful life is a stressful life. If we want to live life on purpose with a lot of meaning, it requires us to go through situations that can be very stressful. It requires us to to perform at a certain level, right? That is going to be stressful. So the good news is that stress is required for any mechanism, for any organism, any system, whether it's the cells in our bodies or for organizations. Stress is a requirement for growth. So if we can start to look at what are the positive upsides of stress, we can choose a different way to look at it. And the mind-blowing thing about the research is that our belief about stress, if we believe that stress is bad for us, it releases the more high-stress negative chemicals in our bodies. If we believe that stress is good for us and we see it as a fuel, as positive energy that can help us step up to a challenge and have more focus and be able to overcome challenges in a meaningful way, that actually changes the brain chemistry of the hormones and the chemicals that are released in our bodies, and it can make all the difference, right? So stress is good for you, but only if you believe it is kind of one of the takeaways of that book.
Yeah. That's powerful. You know, and I fully believe too in kind of how we label things. You know, you experience something, and then the way in which, I guess the other language would be how you frame it, you know, how you choose to view it. And I cannot remember the source. I could kick myself, but someone was talking about, you know, when they looked at the pandemic, and instead of asking, you know, why is this happening, they rephrased it, and they said they reframed it, and they said, what is this trying to tell me? What is this trying to teach me? Mm-hmm. You know, and I thought, wow, that's, and I think that's a little bit of mindset. You know, that's probably more of a growth type of mindset with regards to retreating from something or trying to avoid it or being mad about it. So I think there's a lot of wisdom. I kind of like that concept too. My initial reaction to hear that is stress. You know, I tend to think of it, I have a kind of a negative framing of stress. And I appreciate you sharing that, Hannah, because that's good. You know, I remember having coaches that used to talk to us about, hey, and this would be right before a game, and they'd say, hey, listen, if you're nervous or you're scared, they said, you know what, that's healthy. That's good, because, you know, but you got to trust our preparation. You are prepared in order to excel in this upcoming event or whatever game.
Yeah.
And I think, again, kind of going back and kind of thinking about, that's really when you can, in the middle of a storm, when you can remind yourself, hey, I'm prepared, I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm going to get through this. That's probably a lot healthier and doesn't take as big of a toll on our bodies.
Yeah, so I think we've been flooded with a lot of information about how bad stress is. And I do think there's a different conversation that is also helpful, which is there are a lot of ways that stress is actually really helpful. So if we can think of those and recognize, you know, the full picture of the human stress response. If the only options we have are fight or flight, and that's all we see, right? That's what we're gonna tend towards. Yeah. But we recognize that the human stress response has actually evolved along with humans, and it's much more complex than that. So, you know, over time, we've kind of adapted to fit into the world that we live in now, where it's not like we're getting hunted by predators so much as there's a lot of different psychological and social stressors that we experience. And it can activate a lot of different biological systems, right? So stress can actually be something that helps us engage with our challenges rather than retreat from them. And it can help us connect with social support. And it can help us learn from experience, right? So if we can kind of harvest those aspects of stress, and also we talked about self-awareness earlier, when we become aware of how we do tend to respond and recognize that we can choose a different response, I think that's really powerful. And to me, that's a growth mindset, right? When we recognize that, okay, I can learn from this, I can get better because of this. In fact, I can harness all this nervous or anxious energy I'm feeling, and I can channel it in a productive way. That's a positive thing as well.
Yeah. So I'm curious about examples. I mean, so we've talked about viewing stress as only negative, only something to be minimized and moved through as quickly as possible, versus embracing it as positive energy to learn or grow. Any examples come to mind of a time that maybe you could have approached it one of either way, and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I would say some of the most transformative experiences in my life have started as really kind of stressful and threatening in terms of like status quo and the life that I had, right? So big times of change, which change can be very painful. But they have given way to a whole new outlook on life. And, you know, I have both personal experiences of that and professional career experiences of that. You know, I think of one example, you know, 4 years ago, I chose to quit my corporate career and start as an independent consultant and start a business. Huge time of change and some pain that gave rise to that. But and it's not like this is a perfect thing, you know, like I don't think any of us just go through really stressful experiences and feel like we handled it perfectly. But I think the difference is, do we allow that pain to let us just disconnect and disengage, or do we choose to connect with our support system and our ecosystem? And so, you know, back to the example of when I quit my corporate job, moved to a new town, started a new business. My response to that was, okay, I'm moving to a new town. I don't know anybody. I need to meet some people. And so I started a networking group, and I created this forum where I could meet people and connect with them. And that could have been a time where I'm just kind of locked up and staying in my office and working on just whatever, but I chose to turn outward and connect and create community. And then later on, when I was going through challenging personal time, that community was there for me, and I had a place to go when I had a very stressful time in my life. So I've definitely seen how personally in my life I've gone from tend to be very inward to actually creating community during difficult times.
Yeah. You know, my story is similar. I was a college professor for the first part of my career, and I really kind of, I got a chance to do consulting just kind of on a part-time basis, and really fell in love with it. I was just like, wow, this is what I need to do. So I started looking. At that time, I was at Memphis State University, and my wife and I, we had a young son that had just been born, and I went in to my wife and I said, hey, I'm thinking about taking a new job, looking for trying to go full-time in consulting. I don't want to start a company. I want to join one. She said, that sounds great. So fast forward, I end up getting a job in Cleveland, Ohio, working for Ernst & Young. Great place to work, amazing. But I was way in over my head. I drastically underestimated how big of a change that was, going from a college professor to a senior consultant for Ernst & Young. So I was floundering. I mean, I just was like, wow, I couldn't touch the bottom. I knew I wasn't going to be able to tread water much longer. But I really got lucky. And Hannah, it's kind of similar to your experience that I had two neighbors that I worked with. We rode the train in together, and they literally just kind of put their arms around me and said, hey, you're going to be all right. We're going to help you through this. And it wasn't just work stuff. They helped us through connecting to the neighborhood that we were in. And they had some young children that our son could play with. So it was, I look back at that and I'm just like, I think there's always, and that was a kind of a lesson for me. I was going inward. I had definitely retreated, and I was kind of in my shell, so to speak. And I just kind of learned, hey, you know what? There are people around you that are going to help you out, And so I started kind of opening more back up to that outward possibility. But it was they were amazing. They helped me kind of get on my feet, get established, get focused. They helped my family. They helped us, and so I've kind of spent the rest of my life trying to, pay it forward, like looking for people that maybe are trying something different, right. Literally life-changing kind of change. I don't know if that was a real good definition of like stress. It was very stressful to me, but it was a good thing. And I think that it just helped me be more aware or considerate of kind of that outward aspect.
Nice. Luke, what's an example for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about an example from a team context, and it really had to do with creating a strategy to expand the organization we were a part of. Mm-hmm. We knew to scale, we needed to think about things differently, but we also knew that it wasn't really an option not to continue to grow. That wouldn't really fulfill kind of the purpose of the organization. And so, man, it was probably a 2-year period of just kind of slogging back to the problem over and over again and saying, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to think about this differently? What do we need to learn? Who do we need to go talk to? What analysis do we need to do? And that, to me, that's a really good example of leaning into growth mindset and saying, what do we need to learn differently to be able to face this challenge that was creating stress and creating feelings of, oh no, what's going to happen if we don't figure this out soon. Mm-hmm. And I think the key to that is like managing the stress load. If we hadn't worked on that for 2 years and all of a sudden had been kind of locked in and hadn't been doing that homework, then it would have probably been over the threshold of the stress we could have managed through effectively. Yeah. And I think there would have been probably more damage to the team and challenge to the organization. But since we kind of managed the stress load, tried to figure out what's the right amount of stress to keep us moving forward, I think it worked out pretty well. We learned what we needed to learn and were able to move forward with a strategy. Yeah.
So both of those two examples that you shared are examples of alternative stress responses, right? So we talked about fight or flight at the beginning of the episode. What we have available to us are options, right? And one of the stress responses, so when we recognize that stress actually gives us energy to rise to a challenge, we can look at that. The research calls that a challenge response. So Kelly McGonigal talks about the challenge response helps you increase self-confidence, it motivates action, and it helps you to learn from experience, right? And then the other theme that I heard in all of our examples is reaching out and connecting, right? We've talked a lot about the importance of human connection on this podcast, and we have episodes that we talk more specifically about that if you want to listen back. But there's the respond when we reach out to people instead of just go inward, and we get a more outward orientation through stressful times. That's the research calls that the tend and befriend response. So tend and befriend is when we recognize. So in my example, I realized I'm starting a new business in a new town. I don't know anybody. I'm new in this market, right? I had a big network internally inside the big company I had worked. People knew me. They knew my capabilities. But now I'm starting something brand new and nobody knows me. And so my response was to reach out and connect with people, right? And that's what's called the tend and befriend response. So stress can actually make us more social, and it can encourage connection. So once again, an alternative stress response, right? Not everything is two-dimensional. It doesn't have to be fight or flight. We can rise to the challenge and meet stress as a challenge. And we've talked about flow and state of flow when we feel adequately challenged, right? That's necessary to really get into that state of flow as well. Or we can choose to become more social. So
that's that's powerful. That is really cool. I appreciate you sharing that, Hannah. And I kind of, as you were sharing that, I was thinking about, well, what kept me from not going more social sooner? And I think for me, I really let things like embarrassment or pride, I think, is what derails me. I'm kind of like, man, how could I be so dumb not to anticipate this or not to prepare for this? How could I not think that uprooting my family and going to Cleveland, Ohio, where we knew absolutely no one, I had no experience in that industry, and think that everything was going to be okay, or not need kind of a support group. Yeah. So I think hopefully I've learned that lesson and I'm doing better, but something tells me I still got a ways to go on that.
Yeah, we've talked about, I think, the different brain chemicals, and oxytocin is one of those chemicals that really helps us feel connected to others and to bond with people. It's sometimes called the bonding hormone. And it's actually interesting to note that during stress, our pituitary gland actually releases oxytocin in order to motivate social connection. So that means that stress actually can help us kind of become better versions of ourselves. If we can recognize that and seek connection rather than withdraw and go inward. And so, yeah, like we can look at, if we look at stress from that perspective, right, it helps us with energy and it helps us with connection. I think we can become better people and better leaders. I'd love to hear kind of just what are some takeaways as we've been having this discussion. Luke, what are some of your closing thoughts?
Yeah, so you mentioned this idea of flow, where our skill perfectly meets the level of challenge that we're facing. And, there's a couple ways you can manage that. One is by managing how skilled we are. What do we need to learn? Who else do we need to? The fastest way to add skill is to add someone to our team.
Yeah.
Right. If I really need someone, if I really need a piano to be played, it's much faster for me to go find a piano player than for me to learn to play piano. And so that's sticking with me, this idea of facing challenges smarter by including more people, because that's, as I said earlier, not my natural inclination. And then the other thing that we haven't talked a lot about, but has to do with controlling the level of challenge we face, is managing our expectations. And oftentimes, if we're really facing something that's incredibly stressful, to be able to say, okay, maybe I need to adjust my expectations on what success looks like in this scenario, or on what it looks like to navigate this successfully. Like, what if it was normal that a year, like the last, year, would be something that would be stressful and hard to navigate. And maybe we shouldn't add to the difficulty by feeling shame at making some missteps along the way. Because, why wouldn't someone make some missteps if they're trying to figure some things out that they've never figured out before?
Yeah. Awesome. Great takeaway. How about you?
Well, I like that, Luke. I like, don't feel the shame, of, I can't believe I did that, or just, that's okay. Don't beat yourself up. Let it go. But I think too, for me, a key takeaway, and Hannah, again, thanks for sharing the book. I just wrote it. Where was it?
The Upside of Stress.
Upside of Stress.
Yep.
Thank you. I think for me, what was, and I love that kind of seek connection. It made me think too of, I feel very fortunate. I have a couple of friends that I literally could tell them anything. And, but what makes them unique or so helpful to me is they tell me the truth with love. They literally, they'll call me out, and they'll say, well, that's not what you want to stand for. That's not what you want to be known for. But then they're also, they're supportive. They're like, okay, you're in a hole. Let's talk about how we get out of the hole. But also we're going to have a conversation about how not getting back into that hole.
Yeah.
So I think, I guess my kind of takeaway, I know that's important, but I also would encourage people, in your life, build that connection. Be intentional. If you tend to be more inward, more of an introvert, consider, having those kind of safety valves, if you will, those 2 or 3 people that you could tell them anything, and they're going to help you through that process.
Yeah, no, I think that's really key. And what you mentioned there too is like, how can we go through the situation, or if we experience a similar situation in the future, how can we do it differently, right? And that's kind of the third stress and final stress response that the book talks about, which is really that stress helps us learn and grow. And we've talked about, I think on previous episodes as well, how, one of the reasons we learn more from failure is because of the pain that's associated with failure, right? It makes us stop and pay attention. But sometimes stressful experiences can also be successful experiences, right? We can experience stress in front of public speaking or in front of like for me, a race, right? And I can feel some kind of stress, but then there's that relief and the elation that you feel afterwards when you're done. And all of those feelings, whether they are right, terrible feelings of pain, or they're these like really positive feelings that you get after completing a big task, right? That may have felt stressful, but it's that recovery process that actually helps us remember the experience. And that's what can help us learn next time we go through that experience. So it's because stress tends to heighten the senses in a lot of ways. It helps us create memorable experiences. And I think as a good leadership practice, right, is to do those after action reviews of what went well, what can we learn from this, whether we won or we lost, we learned something. And what was that?
Yeah. Yeah. And how did we behave in ways that aligned with what we believe and what we value, and taking time to celebrate that or learn from not living up to our own expectations. Yeah.
All right, guys. Awesome
cool.
conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
If you would like to learn more about Purpose and Performance Group and the work that we do and how we work with leaders navigating through challenging times, you can reach us. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. Look us up on social media. We'd love to have you be part of our community.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music, and this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.